Hello, hello, hello! Greetings, salutations, konnichiwa, and every other for welcome across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome once again, my dear scholars, to the study. I hope you're all doing well this fine evening, or morning, or afternoon. I make no assumptions. Hello there, Julian20. Welcome. Good evening. Ready for the nightmares? I hope it's not that bad. Hello there, Dr. Zadium. Welcome. If you will pardon me, oh dear. Horace, would you manage to take care of that in just a second? It seems that I managed to pour quite a few bit of my um the water I had onto the study floor. Unfortunately, I will be having to fix that a little bit later. That's what you get when you use an unstable container, it seems. Oh dear. Oh, well, quite the start to tonight's entertainment, it seems. Ah, so how is everyone doing today? I hope you're doing well. And if you're not, I hope this stream brings a little comfort to you. Dear. I myself am, well, I'm middling a little bit. It's been quite an unusually stressful time, it seems. Mm, but still, Dr. Zadium doing fairly well. Ah, good to hear it. Julian20, wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Excuse me. I'm so glad to hear that. Ah, it is the spooky season, isn't it? Now then, I must ask you, scholars, what is your view on ghost stories or tales of the macabre and horrifying? Oh, thank you, Sophia. Thank you for the hydrate. Even if half that water is currently pooling on the floor. Um, Thankfully we have treated floors, so it is not a problem for the moment. Taurus, please, could you please take care of that? What do you mean you don't want to do it? Well, I'm just asking a favor this time. All right, I'll wait till after the stream. Julian20 love them. Firefly have had a pretty productive day. Oh, good. Julian20 a bit on the nippy side here. Oh, it's cold over there. Dr. Zadium, ghost stories can be fun. Sophia Ignose, I love ghost stories. Oh, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it because I have an entire collection of them with me at the moment. They are stories that were written by Montague R. James. I can't remember his middle name for the life of me. My apologies. He taught at Cambridge in the when was it? The 18. Oh, hold on. Oh, in the early 1900s. Well, 1910s actually. Montague Rhodes James. Yes. He published quite a few collections of these ghost stories, and the fun thing about these ghost stories is they were originally meant to be told. He told these stories around every Christmas time in Britain. In some traditions, ghost stories are told at Christmas Eve, and he would tell these ghost stories to a select audience of students. So they are specifically written to be told to an audience. Now, I will say beforehand, they are very academic ghost stories. They rely a lot on academic references, and there is quite a bit of Latin in them actually as well. But I will read them as much as they are written. Um, there will be one or two which I will try to explain the Latin if possible, because I'm not sure how many of you, dear scholars, actually know Latin. I personally don't. Unfortunately, it seems to be one of those bits of knowledge which was sealed away. Julian20, I took Latin in high school. Ah, fascinating, fascinating. So you might know some of these words. Excuse me. So I think we should begin our tales. So, my dear scholars, sit back, relax, have a cold or hot cup of beverage. Firefly, I took a year or two of high school, but I don't remember much of it now. 20, how well, 50 plus years ago. Oh, I see, I see. Well, sit back, relax, have a hot or cold beverage, or if you were like many of M.R. James's audience, have a little bit of wine, and we will begin our journey into the macabre and the occult. My goodness. The mezzotint. Some time ago, I believe I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Dennison during his pursuit of objects of art for the museum at Cambridge. He did not publish his experiences very widely upon his return to England, but they could not fail to become known to a good many of his friends, and among others to the gentleman who at that time presided over an art museum at another university. It was to be expected that the story should make a considerable impression on the mind of a man whose vocation lay in lines similar to Dennison's, and that he should be eager to catch at any explanation of the manner which tended to make it seem improbable that he should ever be called upon to deal with so agitating an emergency. It was indeed somewhat consoling to him to reflect that he was not expected to acquire ancient MSS for his institution. That was the business of the Shelburnian Library. The authorities of that might, if they pleased, ransack obscure corners of the continent for such matters. He was glad to be obliged at the moment to confine his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J. W. Britnell publishes at short intervals very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, and old sketches of mansions, churches, and towns in England and Wales. These catalogues were of course the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams, but as his museum already contained an enormous accumulation of topographical pictures, he was a regular, rather than copious buyer, and he rather looked to Mr. Britnell to fill up gaps in the rank and file of his collection than to supply him with rarities. Now, in February of last year, there appeared upon Mr. Williams' desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Britnell's emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. This latter ran as follows: Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J. W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalogue was with Mr. Williams, as he observed to himself, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry: 978. Unknown. Interesting mezzotint. View of a manor house, early part of the century. 15 by 10 inches. Black frame. £2 2. It was not specially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalog. And so he passed without much excitement of anticipation to the ordinary labors of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expect it, and that of Mr. Britnell proved, as I believe the right phrase goes, no exception to the rule. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, after Mr. Williams had left his work, and it was accordingly brought round to his rooms in college by the attendant, in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came in to tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large, black-framed mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short descriptions given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. Some more details of it will have to be given, though I cannot hope to put before you the look of the picture as clearly as it is present to my own eye. Very nearly the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlors, or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions at the present moment. It was a rather indifferent mezzotint, and an indifferent mezzotint is, perhaps, the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows, with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or vases at the angles, and a small portico in the center. On either side were trees, and in front of a considerable expanse, and in front, and yeah, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend AWF Sculpsit was engraved on the narrow margin, and there was no further inscription. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by affixing the price of £2 to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left-hand half of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters NGLEY Hall. The second, SSEX. It would perhaps be just worth which to identify the place represented, which he could easily do with the help of a gazette of a yeah, which he could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell, with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university I write of indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation, and tea was taken to the accomplishment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon any non-golfing persons. I agree with that. The conclusion arrived at was that certain strokes might have been better, and that in certain emergencies neither player had experienced that amount of luck which a human being has a right to expect. It was now that the friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I am going to try to find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back. Something Hall, either in Sussex or Essex. Half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, I suppose? It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it? Said Binks. Is it for the museum? Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings, said Williams. But for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life. It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think, said Binks. But I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge in front. Well, let's look, said Williams. Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure? Oh, yes, just the head, in the very front of the picture. And indeed there was, hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving. The head of a man or woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator, and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. Still, he said, though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a piece of a place that I don't know. Professor Binks had his work to do, and soon went, and very nearly up to hall time, Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. If the vowel before the NG had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought. But as it is, the name may be anything from Gesterly to Langley, and there are many more names ending like this than I thought, and this rotten book has no index of terminations. Hall in Mr. Williams' college was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon, the less so as he met their colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words with which we have no concern were freely banded across the table, merely golfing words. I would hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening, some few retired to William's rooms, and I have little doubt that whist was played, and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the mezzotint from the table without looking at it, and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, then said in a tone of some interest, "It really is a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite a feeling of the romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whiskey and soda to others of the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. After they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two, and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face upwards on the table, where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor. "Oh, hello there, Serlicos, welcome!" And he declares now that if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. But, as that did not happen, he was able to put down the light on the table and take a good look at the picture. It was indubitable, frankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn, in front of the unknown house, there was a figure where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you that what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it up in a drawer, sported the doors of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late. It was consoling to reflect that the behavior of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. Evidently the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had. Otherwise he might have been tempted to think that something gravely wrong was happening either to his eyes or to his mind. This possibility being fortunately precluded, two matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully, and call in a witness for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbor Nisbet to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend a morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged and arrived about 9:30. His host was not quite dressed, I am sorry to say, even at this late hour. During breakfast, nothing was said about the mezzotint by Williams, save that he had a picture on which he wished for Nisbet's opinion. But those who are familiar with university life can picture for themselves the wide and delightful range of subjects over which the conversation of two fellows of Canterbury College is likely to extend during a Sunday morning breakfast. Hardly a topic was left unchallenged, from golf to lawn tennis. Yet I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centered in that very strange picture which was now reposing, face downwards, in the drawer in the room opposite. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked with very considerable, almost tumultuous excitement. He ran across, unlocked the drawer, and extracting the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nisbet's hands. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why afterwards." "Well," said Nisbet, "I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by moonlight." "Moonlight? You're sure of that?" "Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky." "All right. Go on. I'll swear," added Williams in an aside, "there was no moon when I saw it first." Well, there's not much more to be said, Nisbet continued. The house has one, two, three rows of windows, five in each row, except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of the middle one, and... But what about figures? Said Williams with marked interest. There aren't any, said Nisbet, but... What? No figure on the grass in the front? Not a thing. You'll swear to it? Certainly I will, but there's just one other thing. What? Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open. Is it really? My goodness. He must have got in, said Williams with great excitement, and he hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought two papers to Nisbet, and asked him first to sign one. It was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was William's statement written the night before. What can it all mean? Said Nisbet. Exactly, said Williams. Well, one thing I must do, or three things now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood, his last night's visitor, what he saw, and then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further, and then I must find out what the place is. I can do the photographing myself, said Nisbet, and I will, but you know, it looks very much as if were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already? Or is it going to come off? You must find out what the place is. Yes, he said, looking at the picture again. I expect you're right. He has got in. And if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs. I'll tell you what, said Williams. I'll take the picture across to Old Green. This was the senior fellow of the college, who had been bursar for many years. It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the two counties a lot of his time. Quite likely he will, said Nesbit. But just let me take my photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in Hall last night, and I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday. That's true too, said Williams. I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement, and you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now. In a short time he had returned, and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear of the edge of the picture, but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of its drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was then drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. Now, what do you mean to do? He said. Are you going to sit and watch it all day? Well, no, I think not, said Williams. I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen. But the creature only got into the house. Could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again. But the fact of the window being open, I think must mean that it's in there now, so I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much, if at all, in the daytime. We might go out for a walk this afternoon, and come into tea or whenever it gets dark. I shall leave it out on the table here, and spot the door. My skip can get in, but no one else. The three agreed that this would be a good plan, and further, that if they spent the afternoon together, they would be less likely to talk about the business to other people, for any rumor of such a transaction as was going on would bring the whole of the phantasmalogical society about their ears. We may give them a respite until 5 o'clock. At or near that hour, the three were entering William's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his rooms was unsported. But in a moment it was remembered that on Sunday the skips came for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture, leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left, and the next thing was William's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing, and set the standard of etiquette to all his own college and to several neighboring ones, and nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting on his master's chair, or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel this himself. He started violently when the three men came to the room, and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, "I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to sit down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you some time what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course I don't set up my opinion against yours, but it ain't the picture I should aim where my little girl could see it, sir." "Wouldn't you, Robert?" "Why not?" "No, sir. Why, the poor child. I recollect once she sees a door Bible with pictures, not half what that is, and we had set up with her 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you'll believe me. And if she was to catch a sight of that skeleton here, whatever it is, carrying off the poor baby, she would be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervous they get with a little thing, and all. But what I should say, it don't seem a right picture to be lying about, sir, not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come on it. Should you be wanting anything this evening, sir?" "Thank you, sir." With these words, the excellent man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentleman whom he left lost no time in gathering round the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect, and stepping swiftly with long strides towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face so that only hints of that could be seen, and what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white dome-like forehead and a few strangling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living, it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. Thank you, Sophia, for the hydrate. From 5 to 7, the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safer to leave it, and that they would return after Hall and await further developments. When they assembled again at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one, at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m., he read, from Murray's Guide to Essex, the following lines. 16.5 miles. Annerley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicized in the last century. It contains the tombs of the family of Francis, whose mansion, Annerley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in mezzotint. After his son's disappearance, he lived in complete retirement at the Hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green on his return at once identified the house as Annerley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation of the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know. I'm sure, Williams, what used to be said in the place when I first knew it, which was before I came up here, was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got a chance he used to get a man whom he suspected of it turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them all but one. Squires could do a lot of things then that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country, the last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just the same thing in my own parish." "What, like the man in Tests of the D'Urbervilles?" Can't pronounce that, sorry. Williams put in. "Yes, I dare say, but it's not a book I could ever read myself. But this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church there that belonged to his ancestors, and all that went to sour him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night The keepers found him at it in a wood right at the end of the estate. I could show you the place now. It marches with some land that used to belong to an uncle of mine, and you can imagine there was a row, and this man Gaudy, that was the name, to be sure. Gaudy. I thought I should get it. Gaudy. He was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was what Francis wanted, and grand juries, you know what they would have been then. Poor Gaudy was strung up in double quick time. I've been shown the place he was buried in, on the north side of the church. You know the way, in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them that side. And the idea was that this some friend of Gaudy's, not a relation because he had none, poor devil, he was the last of his line, kind of spes ultima gentis. Must have planned to get a hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know. It's rather an out of the way thing for an Essex poacher to think of. But you know, I should say now it looks more as if old Gaudy had managed the job himself. Boo! I hate to think of it. Have some whiskey, Williams. The facts were communicated by Williams to Dennison, and by him to a mixed company, of which I was one, and the Satterson professor of ophiology another. I am sorry to say that the latter, when asked what he thought of it, only remarked, "Oh, those Bridgeford people will say anything," a sentiment which met with the reception it deserved. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashline Museum, that it has been treated with a view to discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used in it, but without effect. That Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again. Quite the rare little piece of artwork, wouldn't you say? Mm. Oh, Julian 20, great story. Oh, thank you. But we must credit the writer, of course. Yes. A fun little fact for you, this story that I just read was just recently adapted, I believe last year, by the BBC for their annual Ghost Story at Christmas specials. I have yet to see it myself, but it's an interesting choice for a story, I think. It's one of my personal favorites. Julian 20, I need to see that. Ah, well, I'm certain somehow you can. Sophia Ignose. Oh, yes, yeah, yes. For those who don't know, every year, well, for almost every year, the BBC adapts an M.R. James story, for the most part, for their annual Ghost Story at Christmas TV specials. They did quite a few in the 70s, stopped, and then they returned to doing them at the turn of in the recent years. Um, they're quite good. They're quite good, but of course they do make tiny little changes, barring one story where they really changed a lot of things for it. Otherwise, no, they're quite good. I highly recommend seeing them if you can. Give me 1 second, and we will move on to our next story. Our next story is entitled rats. And if you was to walk through the bedrooms now, you'd see the ragged, moldy bedcloths a heavin' and a heavin' like seas. And a heavin' with what? He says. Why, with the rats under them. But was it with the rats? I ask. Because in another case it was not. I cannot put a date to the story, but I was young when I heard it, and the teller was old. It is an ill proportioned tale, but that is my fault, not his. It happened in Suffolk, near the coast, in a place where the road makes a sudden dip and then a sudden rise. As you go in... Oh, I almost forgot. Ah, give me 1 second. I forgot to put our little thing. There we are. Aha! I got so carried away with the story. Forgot to part the curtains. In a place where the road makes a sudden dip and then a sudden rise. As you go northward, at the top of that rise stands a house on the left of the road. It is a tall red brick house, narrow for its height. Perhaps it was built about 1770. The top of the front has a low triangular pediment with a round window in the center. Behind it are stables and offices, and such garden as it has is behind them. Scraggly Scotch firs are near it. An expanse of gorse-covered land stretches away from it. It commands a view of the distant sea from the upper windows of the front. A sign on a post stands before the door, or did so stand, for though it was an inn of repute once, I believe it is so no longer. To this inn came my acquaintance, Mr. Thompson, when he was a young man, on a fine spring day, coming from the University, Cambridge, and desirous of solitude and tolerable quarters, and time for reading. These he found, for the landlord and his wife had been in service, and could make a visitor comfortable, and there was no one else staying in the inn. He had a large room on the first floor commanding the road, and the view, and if it faced east, why, that could not be helped. The house was well built and warm. He spent very tranquil and uneventful days. Work all the morning, an afternoon perambulation of the country round, a little conversation with country company, or the people of the inn in the evening over the then fashionable drink of brandy and water, a little more reading and writing, and bed, and he would have been content that this should continue for the full month he had at disposal, so well was his work progressing, and so fine was the April of that year, which I have reason to believe was that which Orlando Whistlecraft chronicles in his weather record as the charming year. One of his walks took him along the northern road, which stands high and traverses a wide common, called a hearth. On the bright afternoon, when he first chose this direction, his eyes caught a white object, some hundreds of yards to the left of the road, and he felt it necessary to make sure what this might be. It was not long before he was standing by it, and found himself looking at a square block of white stone, fashioned somewhat like the base of a pillar, with a square hole in the upper surface. Just such another you may see at this day on Thetford hearth. After taking stock of it, now, after taking stock of it, he contemplated for a few minutes the view, which offered a church tower or two, some red roofs of cottages, and windows, winking in the sun, and the expanse of sea, also with an occasional wink and gleam about it, and so pursued his way. In the desultory evening talk in the bar, he asked why the white stone was there on the common. "An old-fashioned thing, that is," said the landlord, Mr. Betts. "We was none of us alive when that was put there." Firefly. I'm only seeing a trailer for the Mezzotint, but it looks like the BBC's version of Martin's Close is on YouTube. Yeah, the Mezzotint is not on YouTube, but Martin's Close is. There's some more if you can buy it. I won't if you look. You'll find them somewhere. That's all I'll say. That's all I'll say. "An old-fashioned thing, that is," said the landlord, Mr. Betts. "We was none of us alive when that was put there." "That's right," said another. Stands pretty high," said Mr. Thompson. Stands pretty high," said Mr. Thompson. I dare, I dare say a sea mark was on it some time back." "Ah, yes," Mr. Betts agreed. "I have heard that they could see it from the boats. Whatever there was, it's fell to bits this long time." "Good job, too," said a third. "'Twarn't a lucky mark, by what the old men used to say. Not lucky for the fishing, I mind to say." "Why ever not?" said Thompson. "Well, I never see it myself," was the answer, "but they had some funny ideas, what I mean peculiar, them old chaps, and I shouldn't wonder what they made away with theirselves." It was impossible to get anything clearer than this. The company, never very voluble, fell silent, and when next someone spoke, it was of village affairs and crops. Mr. Betts was the speaker. Not every day did Thompson consult his health by taking a country walk. One very fine afternoon, he found himself busily writing at 3 o'clock. Then he stretched himself and rose, and walked out of his room into the passage. Facing him was another room, then the stairhead, then two more rooms, one looking out to the back, the other to the south. At the south end of the passage was a window, to which he went, considering with himself that it was rather a shame to waste such a fine afternoon. However, work was paramount just at the moment. He thought he would just take 5 minutes off and go back to it, and those 5 minutes he would employ, the Bettses could not possibly object, to looking at the other rooms in the passage, which he had never seen. Nobody at all, it seemed, was indoors, probably as it was market day. They were all gone to the town, except perhaps a maid in the bar. Very still the house was, and the sun shone really hot. Early flies buzzed in the window panes. So he explored. The room facing his own was undistinguished, except for an old print of Bury St. Edmunds. The two next to him on his side of the passage were gay and clean, with one window apiece, whereas his had two. Remained the southwest room, opposite to the last which he had entered. This was locked, but Thompson was in a mood of quite indefensible curiosity, and feeling confident that there could be no damaging secrets in a place so easily got at, he proceeded to fetch the key of his own room, and when that did not answer, to collect the keys of the other three. One of them fitted, and he opened the door. The room had two windows looking south and west, so Solar Coast, time for me to head out. Good night, everybody. Oh, thank you for coming, though, Solar Coast. I'm glad you could be here. Take care. The room had two windows, looking south and west, so it was as bright and the sun as hot upon it as could be. Here there was no carpet, but bare boards, no picture, no washing stand, only a bed in the farther corner, an iron bed, with mattresses and bolster, covered with a bluish checked counterpane. As featureless a room as you can well imagine. And yet, there was something that made Thompson close the door very quickly and yet quietly behind him, and lean against the window sill in the passage, actually quivering all over. It was this, that under the counterpane someone lay. Not only lay, but stirred. That it was someone and not something was certain, because the shape of a head was unmistakable on the bolster. And yet it was all covered, and no one lies with covered head, but a dead person. And this was not dead, not truly dead, for it heaved and shivered. If he had seen these things in dusk, or by the light of a flickering candle, Thompson could have comforted himself and talked of fancy. On this bright day, that was impossible. What was to be done? First, lock the door at all costs. Very gingerly he approached it, and bending down, listened, holding his breath. Perhaps there might be a sound of heavy breathing, and a prosaic explanation. There was absolute silence. But as, with a rather tumultuous hand, he put the key into its hole and turned it, it rattled. And on the instant, a stumbling, padding tread was heard coming towards the door. Thompson fled like a rabbit to his room and locked himself in. Futile enough he knew it was. Would doors and locks be any obstacle to what he suspected? But it was all he could think of at that moment, and in fact nothing happened. Only there was a time of acute suspense, followed by a misery of doubt as to what to do. The impulse, of course, was to slip away as soon as possible from a house which contained such an inmate. But only the day before he had said he should be staying for at least a week more, and how, if he changed plans, could he avoid the suspicion of having pried into places where he certainly had no business? Moreover, either the Bettses knew all about the inmate and yet did not leave the house, or knew nothing, which equally meant that there was nothing to be afraid of, or knew just enough to make them shut up the room, but not enough to weigh on their spirits. In any of these cases, it seemed that not much was to be feared, and certainly so far he had had no sort of ugly experience. On the whole, the line of least resistance was to stay. Well, he stayed out his week. Nothing took him past that door, and often as he would pause in a quiet hour of day or night in the passage and listen, no sound whatever issued from that direction. You might have thought that Thompson would have made some attempt at ferreting out stories connected with the inn. Hardly, perhaps, from Betts's, but from the parson of the parish or old people in the village. But no. The wretched scene which commonly falls on people who have had strange experiences and believe in them was upon him. Nevertheless, as the end of his stay drew near, his yearning after some kind of explanation grew more and more acute. On his solitary walks he persisted in planning out some way, the least obtrusive, of getting another daylight glimpse into that room, and eventually arrived at this scheme. He would leave by an afternoon train about 4 o'clock. When his fly was waiting and his luggage on it, he would make one last expedition upstairs to look round his own room and see if anything was left unpacked. And then, with that key, which he had contrived to oil, as if that made any difference, the door should once more be opened for a moment and shut. So it worked out. The bill was paid, the consequent small talk gone through while the fly was loaded. Pleasant parts of the country. Been very comfortable, thanks to you and Mrs. Betts. Hope to come back sometime. On one side or the other. On the other. On one side. On the other. Very glad you found satisfaction, sir. Done our best. Always glad to have your good word. Very much favoured we've been with the weather, to be sure. Then, I'll just take a look upstairs, in case I've left a book or something out. No, don't trouble. I'll be back in a minute. And as noisily as possible, he stole to the door and opened it. The shattering of the illusion. He almost laughed aloud. Propped, or you might say sitting on the edge of the bed, was nothing in the round world but a scarecrow. A scarecrow out of the garden, of course, dumped into the deserted room. Yes, but here amusement ceased. Have scarecrows bare, bony feet? Do their heads loll onto their shoulders? Have they iron collars and links of chain about their necks? Can they get up and move, if never so stiffly, across a floor with wagging head and arms close at their sides, and shiver? The slam of the door, the dash to the stairhead, the leap downstairs were followed by a faint. Awaking, Thompson saw Betts standing over him with the brandy bottle and a very reproachful face. "You shouldn't have done so, sir. Really, you shouldn't. It ain't a kind way to act by persons as done the best they could for you." Thompson heard words of this kind, but what he said in reply he did not know. Mr. Betts, and perhaps even more Mrs. Betts, found it hard to accept his apologies, and his assurances that he would say no word that could damage the good name of the house. However, they were accepted. Since the train could not now be caught, it was arranged that Thompson should be driven to the town to sleep there. Before he went, the Bettses told him what little they knew. "I say he was landlord here a long time back, and was in with the highwaymen that had their beat about the earth. That's how he come by his end. On in chains, they say, up where you see that stone where the gallows stood in. Yes, the fishermen made away with that, I believe, because they see it out at sea, and it kept the fish off, according to their idea. Yes, we had the account from the people that had the house before we come. You keep that room shut up, they say, but don't move the bed out, and you'll find there won't be no trouble. And no more there has been, not once he ain't come out into the house, though what he might do now that there ain't no sign. Anyway, you're the first I know which seen him since we been here. I never set eyes on him myself, nor don't want. And ever since we've made the servants' rooms in the stabling, we ain't had no difficulty that way. Only, I do hope, sir, as you'll keep a close tongue considering how an house do get talked about, with more to this effect. With more to this effect. The promise of silence was kept for many years. The occasion of my hearing the story at last was this: that when Mr. Thompson came to stay with my father, it fell to me to show him to his room. And instead of letting me open the door for him, he stepped forward and threw it open himself, and then for some moments stood in the doorway, holding up his candle and looking narrowly into the interior. And then he seemed to recollect himself and said, "I beg your pardon, very absurd, but I can't help doing that for a particular reason." What that reason was, I heard some days afterwards. And you have heard now. Talk about an interesting guest, huh? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Julian 20, my goodness. Yes, yes, indeed. Oh my goodness. So, my dear scholars, I'm going to take a short break before I read the next story so I can collect myself a little bit. I will be right back. Enjoy your little time while I'm gone. Thank you so much, Horace. That was great help for tonight. Oh, hello. I'm back. Welcome back, my dear scholars. I hope you enjoyed the little intermission. Just had to get myself all prepared for the next story. Now, this story might be the last story for the night. We shall see. I hope you're all ready for this. This one's another one that I'm rather fond of, and it's this one shows up in a lot of interesting little horror collections. So and I'll you'll see the reason why at the end. For which I will have to translate some Latin for all of you. All right. So this story is an episode of Cathedral History. There was once a learned gentleman who was deputed to examine and report upon the archives of the Cathedral of Southminster. The examination of these records demanded a very considerable expenditure of time. Hence it became advisable for him to engage lodgings in the city. For though the cathedral body was profuse in their offers of hospitality, Mr. Lake felt that he would prefer to be master of his day. This was recognized as reasonable. The dean eventually wrote advising Mr. Lake, if he were not already suited, to communicate with Mr. Warby, the principal verger, who occupied a house convenient to the church, and was prepared to take in a quiet lodger for 4 weeks. Such an arrangement was precisely what Mr. Lake desired. Terms were easily agreed upon, and early in December, like another Mr. Datchery, as he remarked to himself, the investigator found himself in the occupation of a very comfortable room in an ancient and cathedraly home. One so familiar with the customs of cathedral churches, and treated with such obvious consideration by the dean and chapter of this cathedral in particular, could not fail to command the respect of the head verger. Mr. Warby even acquiesced to in certain modifications of statements he had been accustomed to offer for years to parties of visitors. Mr. Lake, on his part, found the verger to be a very cheery companion, and took advantage of any occasion that presented itself for enjoying his conversation when the day's work was over. One evening, about 9 o'clock, Mr. Warby knocked at his lodger's door. "I've occasioned," he said, "to go across to the cathedral, Mr. Lake, and I think I made you a promise when I did so next I would give you the opportunity to see what it looks like at night time. It's quite fine and dry outside, if you care to come." "To be sure I will. Very much obliged to you, Mr. Warby, for thinking of it, but let me get my coat." "Here it is, sir. And I've another lantern here that you'll find advisable for the steps, as there's no moon." "Anyone might think we were Jasper and Durdles over again, might they?" said Lake, as they crossed the close, for he had asserted that the verger had read Edwin Drood. "So they might," said Mr. Warby with a short laugh, "though I don't know whether we ought to take it as a compliment. Odd ways, I often think, as they had at that cathedral. Don't it seem so to you, sir? Full choir, full choral matins at 7 o'clock in the morning all the year round. Wouldn't suit our boys' voices nowadays, and I think there's one or two of the men would be applying for a rise if the chapter was to bring it in, particular the altos." They were now at the southwest door. As Mr. Warby was unlocking it, Lake said, "Did you ever find anybody locked in here by accident?" "Twice I did. One was a drunk sailor, How he got in, I don't know. I suppose he went to sleep at the service, but by the time I got to him, he was praying fit to bring the roof in. Law, what a noise that man did make! Said it was the first time he'd been inside a church for 10 years, and blessed if ever he'd try it again. The other was an old sheep. Them boys it was, up to their games. That was the last time they tried it on, though. There, sir. Now you see what we look like. They did use now and again to bring parties in, but he preferred a moonlight night, and there was a piece of verse he'd quote 'em, related to a Scotch cathedral. I understand. But I don't know. I always think the effect's better when it's all dark like. Seems to add to the saws and hearth. Sorry about the change in the accent, I just realized this guy's not probably upper class. Now, if you don't mind stopping somewhere in the nave while I go up into the choir where my business lies, you'll see what I mean. Accordingly, Lake waited, leaning against the pillar, and watched the lights wavering along the length of the church, and up the steps into the choir, until it was intercepted by some screen or other furniture, which only allowed the reflection to be seen on the piers and roof. Not many minutes had passed before Warby reappeared at the door of the choir, and by waving his lantern signaled to Lake to rejoin him. "I suppose it is Warby, and not a substitute," thought Lake to himself as he walked up the nave. There was in fact nothing untowards. Warby showed him the papers which he had come to fetch out of the dean's stall, and asked him what he thought of the spectacle. Lake agreed that it was well worth seeing. "I suppose," he said as they walked towards the altar steps together, "that you're too much used to going about—" Oh, sorry, wrong guy. "I suppose," he said as they walked towards the altar steps together, "that you're too much used to going about here at night to feel nervous. But you must get a start every now and then, don't you, when a book falls down or a door swings to?" "No, Mr. Lake, I can't say I think much about noises. Not nowadays. I'm much more afraid of finding an escape of gas or a burst in the stovepipes than anything else. Still, there have been times. Years ago. Did you notice that plain altar tomb there? 15th century say it is. I don't know if you agree to that. Well, if you didn't look at it, just come back and give it a glance, if you'd be so good." It was on the north side of the choir, and rather awkwardly placed, only about 3 feet from the enclosing stone screen. Quite plain, as the verger had said, but for some ordinary stone paneling. A metal cross of some size on the northern side, that next to the screen, was the solitary feature of any interest. Lake agreed that it was not earlier than the Perpendicular period, "but," he said, "unless it's the tomb of some remarkable person, you'll forgive me for saying that I don't think it's particularly noteworthy." "Well, I can't say as it's the tomb of anybody noted in history," said Warby, who had a dry smile on his face, "for we don't own any record whatsoever of who was put up to. For all that, if you have half an hour to spare, sir, when we get back to the house, Mr. Lake, I could tell you a tale about that tomb. I won't begin on it now. It's dark's cold here, and we don't want to be dawdling about all night."
"Of course, I should like to hear it immensely."
"Very well, sir, you shall. Now, if I might put a question to you," he went on as they passed down the choir aisle, "in our little local guide, and not only there, but in the little book on our cathedral in the series, you'll find it stated that this portion of the building was erected previous to the 12th century. Now, of course, I should be glad enough to take that view, but, mind the step, sir, but I put it to you, does the lay of the stone here in this portion of the wall," which he tapped with his key, "does it to your eye carry the flavour of what you might call Saxon masonry? No, I thought not. No more it does to me. Now,
If you'll believe me, I've said as much to those men. One's the librarian of our free library here, and the other came down from London on purpose, 50 times, if I have once. But I might just as well have talked to that bit of stonework. But there it is. I suppose everyone's got their opinions.
The discussion of this particular trait of human nature occupied Mr. Warby almost up to the moment when he and Lake re entered the former's house. The condition of the fire in Lake's sitting room led to a suggestion from Mr. Warby that they should finish the evening in his own parlor. We find them, accordingly, settled there some short time afterwards. Mr. Warby made his story a long one, and I will not undertake to tell it wholly in his own words, or in his own order. Lake committed the substance of it to paper immediately after hearing it, together with some few passages of the narrative which had fixed themselves verbatim in his mind. I shall probably find it expedient to condense Lake's record to some extent. Mr. Warby was born, it appeared, about the year 1828. His father before him had been connected with the cathedral, and likewise his grandfather. One or both had been choristers, and in later life both had done work, as mason and carpenter respectively, about the fabric. Warby himself, though possessed, as he frankly acknowledged, of an indifferent voice, had been drafted in the choir at about 10 years of age. Excuse me. It was in 1840 that the wave of the Gothic revival smote the Cathedral of Southminster. "There was a lot of lovely stuff went then, sir," said Warby with a sigh. "My father couldn't hardly believe it when he got his orders to clear out the choir. There was a new dean just come in, Dean Burscott he was, and my father had been apprenticed to a good firm of joiners in the city, and knew what good work was when he saw it. Cruel it was, he used to say, all that beautiful wainscot oak, as good as the day it was put up, and garlands like of foliage and fruit, and lovely old gilding work on the coats of arms and the organ pipes. All went to the timber yard, every bit, except some little pieces worked up in the Lady Chapel, and here in this overmantel. Well, I might be mistook, but I say our choir never looked as well since. Still, there was a lot found out about the history of the church, and no doubt, but what it did stand in need of repair, there was a very few that what it but what it did stand in need of repair. There was very few winters passed, but what we'd lose a pinnacle." Mr. Lake expressed his concurrence with Warby's views of restoration, but owns to a fear about this point lest the story proper should never be reached. Possibly this was perceptive in his manner. Warby hastened to reassure him. "Not but what I could carry on about that topic for hours at a time, and do when I see my opportunity. But Dean Burscott he was very set on the Gothic period, and nothing would serve him but everything must be made agreeable to that. And one morning, after service, he appointed for my father to meet him in the choir, and he came back after he'd taken off his robe in the vestry, and he'd gotten a roll of paper with him, and the verger that was then brought in a table, and they began spraying it out on the table with prayer books to keep it down, and my father helped him, and he saw it was a picture of the inside of a choir in a cathedral, and the dean, he was a quick-spoken gentleman, he says, 'Well, Worby, what do you think of that?' 'Why,' says my father, 'I don't think I'd have the pleasure of knowing that view. Would that be Hereford Cathedral, Mr. Dean?' 'No, Worby,' says the dean, 'that's Southminster Minster Cathedral as we hope to see it before many years.' 'Indeed, sir,' says my father, and that was all he did say, lessways the dean. But he used to tell me he felt really faint in himself
when he looked round our choir, as I can remember it, all comfortable and furnished like, and then see this nasty little dry picter, as he called it, drawn out by some London architect. Well, there I am again, but you'll see what I mean if you look at this old view. Werby reached down a framed print across from the wall. Well, the long and short of it was that the Dean he handed over to my father a copy of an order of the chapter that he was to clear out every bit of the choir, make a clean sweep, ready for the new work that was being designed up in town, and he was to put it in hand as soon as ever he could get the breakers together. Now then, sir, if you look at that view, you'll see where the pulpit used to stand. That's what I want you to notice, if you please.
It was indeed easily seen, an unusually large structure of timber, with a dome-sounding board, standing at the east end of the stalls on the north side of the choir, facing the bishop's throne. Werby proceeded to explain that during the alterations, services were held in the nave, the members of the choir being thereby disappointed of an anticipated holiday, and the organist in particular incurring the suspicion of having wilfully damaged the mechanism of the temporary organ that was hired at a considerable expense from London. The work of demolition began with the choir screen and organ loft, and proceeded gradually eastwards, disclosing, as Werby said, many interesting features of older work. While this was going on, the members of the chapter were, naturally, in and about the choir a great deal, and it soon became apparent to the elder Werby, who could not help overhearing some of their talk, that on the part of the senior canons especially, there must have been a good deal of disagreement before the policy now being carried out had been adopted. Some were of the opinion that they should catch their deaths of cold in the return stalls, unprotected by a screen from the draughts in the nave. Others objected to being exposed to the view of persons in the choir aisles, especially, they said, during the sermons, when they found it helpful to listen in a posture which was liable to miscon yeah, which was liable to miscons pardon me, which was liable to misconstruction. The strongest opposition, however, came from the oldest of the body, who up to the last moment objected to the removal of the pulpit. "You ought not to touch it, Mr. Dean," he said with great "You ought not to touch it, Mr. Dean," he said with great emphasis one morning when the two were standing before it. "You don't know what mischief you may do." "Mischief? It's not a work of any particular merit, Canon." "Don't call me Canon," said the old man with great asperity. "That is, for 30 years I've been known as Dr. Aloff, and I shall be obliged, Mr. Dean, if you would kindly humour me in that manner. And as to the pulpit, which I've preached from for 30 years, though I don't insist on that, all I'll say is, I know you're doing wrong in moving it." "But what sense could there be, my dear doctor, in leaving it where it is, when I were fitting up the rest of the choir in a totally different style? What reason could be given, apart from the look of the thing?" "Reason? Reason?" said old Dr. Aloff. "If you, young man, if I may say so without any disrespect to Mr. Dean, if you'd only listen to reason a little, and not be always asking for it, we should get on better. But there, I've had my say." The old gentleman hobbled off, and as it proved, never entered the cathedral again. The season, it was a hot summer, turned sickly on a sudden. Dr. Aloff was one of the first to go, with some affliction of the muscles of the thorax, which took him painfully at night. And at many services the number of choirmen and boys was very thin.
Meanwhile, the pulpit had been done away with. In fact, the sounding board, part of which still exists as a table in a summer house in the palace garden, was taken down within an hour or two of Dr. Alof's protest. The removal of the base, not effected without considerable trouble, disclosed to view, greatly to the exultation of the restoring party, an altar tomb. The tomb, of course, to which Warby had attracted Lake's attention that same evening. Much fruitless research was expended in attempts to identify the occupant. From that day to this, he has never had a name put to him. The structure had been most carefully boxed in under the pulpit base, so that such slight ornament as it possessed was not defaced. Only on the north side of it there was what looked like an injury, a gap between two of the slabs composing the side. It might be 2 or 3 inches across. Palmer, the mason, was directed to fill it up in a week's time, when he came to do some other small jobs near that part of the choir. The season was undoubtedly a very trying one. Whether the church was built on a site that had once been a marsh, as was suggested, or for whatever reason, the residents in its immediate neighborhood had, many of them, but little enjoyment of the exquisite sunny days and the calm nights of August and September. To several of the older people, Dr. Alof among others, as we have seen, the summer proved downright fatal. But even among the younger, few escaped either a sojourn in bed for a matter of weeks, or at the least a brooding sense of oppression, accompanied by hateful nightmares. Gradually, there formulated itself a suspicion, which grew into a conviction, that the alterations in the cathedral had something to say in the matter. The widow of a former old verger, a pensioner of the chapter of Southminster, was visited by dreams, which she retailed to her friends, of a shape that slipped out of the little door of the south transept as the dark fell in, and flitted, taking a fresh direction every night, about the close, disappearing for a while in house after house, and finally emerging again when the night sky was paling. She could see nothing of it, she said, but that it was a moving form. Only she had an impression that when it returned to the church, as it seemed to do in the end of the dream, it turned its head, and then, she could not tell why, but she thought it had red eyes. Warby remembered hearing the old lady tell this dream at a tea party in the house of the chapter clerk. Its recurrence might perhaps, he said, be taken as a symptom of approaching illness. At any rate, before the end of September, the old lady was in her grave. The interest excited by the restoration of this great church was not confined to its own county. One day that summer an F.S.A. of some celebrity visited the place. His business was to write an account of the discoveries that had been made for the Society of Antiquities, and his wife, who accompanied him, was to make a series of illustrative drawings for his report. Pardon. In the morning she employed herself in making a general sketch of the choir. In the afternoon she devoted herself to details. She first drew the newly exposed altar tomb, and when that was finished, she called her husband's attention to a beautiful piece of diaper ornament on the screen just behind it,
which had, like the tomb itself, been completely concealed by the pulpit. Of course, he said, an illustration of that must be made. So she seated herself on the tomb, and began a careful drawing, which occupied her till dusk. Her husband by this time finished his work of measuring and description, and they agreed that it was time to be getting back to their hotel. "You may as well brush my skirt, Frank," said the lady. "It must have gotten covered with dust, I'm sure." He obeyed dutifully, but after a moment he said, "I don't know whether you value this dress particularly, my dear, but I'm inclined to think it's seen its best days. There's a great bit of it gone." "Gone? Where?" said she. "I don't know where it's gone. I don't know where it's gone, but it's off at the bottom edge behind it." She pulled it hastily into sight, and was horrified to find a jagged tear extending some way into the substance of the stuff. "Very much," she said, "as if a dog had rent it away." The dress was, in any case, hopelessly spoilt, to her great vexation, and though they looked everywhere, the missing piece could not be found. There were many ways, they concluded, in which the injury might have come about, for the choir was full of odd bits of woodwork with nails sticking out of them. Finally, they could only suppose that one of these had caused the mischief, and that the workmen, who had been about all day, had carried off the particular piece with the fragment of dress still attached to it. It was about this time, Warby thought, that his little dog began to wear an anxious expression when the hour for it to be put into the shed in the backyard approached, for his mother had ordained that it must not sleep in the house. One evening, he said, when he was just going to pick it up and carry it out, it looked at him like a Christian, and waved its hand and was going to say, "Well, you know how you do carry on sometimes," and the end of it was I put it under my coat and huddled it upstairs. I'm afraid I as good as deceived my poor mother on the subject. After that the dog acted very artful with hiding himself under the bed for half an hour or more before bedtime came. I worked it so as my mother never found out what we'd done. Of course, Warby was glad of its company anyhow, but more particularly when the nuisance that is still remembered in Southminster as the crying set in. "Night after night," said Warby, "that dog seemed to know it was coming. He'd creep out, he would, and snuggle into bed, and cuddle right up to me, shivering. And when the crying come, it'd be like a wild thing, showing his head under my arm, and I was fully near as bad. 6 or 7 times we'd hear it, not more, and when he'd draw out his head again, I'd know it was over for that night. What was it like, sir? Well, I'd never heard it. I never heard but one thing that seemed to hit it off. I happened to be playing about in the close, and there was 2 of the cannons met and said, 'Good morning,' one to another. 'Sleep well last night?' says one. It was Mr. Henslow, that one, and Mr. Lyle was the other. 'Can't say I did,' says Mr. Lyle. 'Rather too much of a Zia.' And here is where I can't read Roman numerals. I'm sorry, my dear scholars. 'Rather too much of a Zia XXX 1v14 for me.' 'XXX 1v14?' says Mr. Henslow. 'What's that?' 'You call yourself a Bible reader?' says Mr. Lyle. Mr. Henslow, you must know, was one of what used to be termed Cinnamons. Yeah, Syrian's lot. Pretty much what we should call the evangelical party. You go and look it up.
I wanted to know what he was getting at myself, and so off I ran home and got out my own Bible, and there it was. The satyr shall cry to his fellow. Well, I thought, is that what we've been listening to these past nights? And I tell you, it made me look over my shoulder a time or two. Of course, I'd asked my father and mother about what it could be before that, but they both said it was most likely cats. They spoke very short, and I could see they were troubled. My word, there was a noise. That was a noise. Hungry like, as if it was calling after someone that wouldn't come. If ever you felt you wanted company, it would be when you was waiting for it to begin again. I believe 2 or 3 nights there was men put on to watch it in different parts of the close, but they all used to get together in one corner, the nearest they could to the high street, and nothing came of it. Well, the next thing was this. Me and another of the boys, he's in business in the city now as a grocer like his father before him, we'd gone up in the choir after morning services was over. We heard old Palmer the mason bellowing in some of he. Yeah, it's hard to keep this accent up. Bellowing to some of his men. So we went up nearer because we knew he was a rusty old chap, and there might be some fun going. It appears Palmer told this men to stop up the chink in that old tomb. Well, there was this man keeping on saying he'd done it the best he could, and there was Palmer carrying on like all possessed about it. Call that making a job of it? He's, he says, if you had your rights, you'd get the sack for this. What do you suppose I pay you your wages for? What do you suppose I'm going to say to the dean and chapter when they come round, as come they may do any time, and see where you'd been bungling about covering the old place with mess and plaster and Lord knows what? Well, master, I done the best I could, says the man. I don't know no more than what you do how I'd come to fall out this way. I tamped it right in the hole, he says, and now it's fell out. He says, I never see. Oh, goodness. Fell out, says old Palmer. Why, it's nowhere near the place. Blowed out, you mean. And he picked up a bit of plaster, and so did I, that was laying up against the screen, 3 or 4 feet off, and not dry yet. And old Palmer he looked at it curious like, and he turned round on me and he says, now then, you boys, have you been up to some of your games here? No, I says, I haven't, Mr. Palmer. There's none of us been around about here till just this minute. And while I was talking the other boy, Evans, he got looking in through the chink, and I heard him drawing his breath, and he came away sharp and up to us, and says he, I believe there's something in there. I saw something shiny. What, I dare say, says old Palmer. Well, I ain't got time to stop about there. You, William, you go off and get some more stuff and make a job of it this time. If not, there'll be trouble in my yard, he says.
Oh my goodness, this is difficult to do. Oh, oh, good thing I grabbed more water.
So the man he went off, and Palmer too, and us boys stopped behind. And I says to Evan, did you really see anything in there? Yes, he says, I did indeed. So then I says, let's shove something in, and stir it up. And we tried several of the bits of wood that were laying about, but they were all too big. Then Evans, he had a sheet of music he'd brought with him, an anthem or a service, I forget which it was now. He rolled it up small and shoved it in the chink. 2 or 3 times he did it, and nothing happened. Give it me, boy, I said, and I had a try. No, nothing happened. Then, I don't know why I thought of it, I'm sure, but I stooped down just opposite the chink and put my 2 fingers in my mouth and whistled. You know the way. And at that, I seemed to think I heard something stirring. And I says to Evan, "Come away," I says. "I don't like this." "Oh, rot," he says. "Give me that roll." And he took it and shoved it in. And I don't think I ever see anyone go so pale as he did. "I say, Warby," he says, "it's caught, or else someone's got a hold of it. Pull it out or leave it." I says, "Come and let's get off." So he gave a good pull, and it came away. Leastways, most of it did. But the end was gone. Tore off it was, and Evans looked at it for a second, and then he gave a sort of croak and let it drop, and we both made off out of there as quick as ever we could. When we got outside, Evans says to me, "Did you see the end of that paper?" "No," I says, "only it was torn." "Yes, it was," he says, "but it was wet too, and black." Well, partially because of the fright we had, and partially because that music was wanted in a day or two, we knew they'd be a set out about it with the organist. We didn't say nothing to anyone else. I suppose the workmen they swept up the bit that was left along with the rest of the rubbish. But Evans, if you were to ask him this very day about it, he'd stick to it that he saw that paper wet and black at the end where it was torn.
Oh my goodness. After that, the boys gave the choir a wide berth, so that Warby was not sure what was the result of the mason's renewed mending of the tomb. Only he made out from the fragments of conversation dropped by the workmen passing through the choir that some difficulty had been met with, and that the governor, Mr. Palmer to wit, had tried his own hand at the job. A little later, he happened to see Mr. Palmer himself knocking at the door of the deanery, and being admitted by the butler. A day or so after that, he gathered from a remark his father let fall at breakfast that something a little out of the common was to be done in the cathedral after morning service on the morrow. "And I just as soon it was to day," his father added. "I don't see the use of running risks." "Father," I says, "what are you going to do in the cathedral tomorrow?" And he turned on me as savage as I ever see him. He was a wonderful good-tempered man as a general thing, my poor father was. "My lad," he says, "I'll trouble you not to go picking up your elders and betters talk. It's not manners, and it's not straight. What I'm going to do or not going to do in the cathedral tomorrow is none of your business. And if I catch sight of you hanging about the place tomorrow after your work's done, I'll send you home with a flea in your ear. Now you mind that." Of course I said I was very sorry, and equally of course I went off and laid my plans with Evans. Naughty kids. We knew there was a stair up in the corner of the transept which you can get up to the triforum, and in them days the door to it was pretty well always open, and even if it wasn't, we knew the key usually laid under a bit of matting hard by. So we made up our minds we'd be putting away music, and then next morning, while the rest of the boys were clearing off, and then slip up the stairs and watch from the triforum if there was any sign of work going on. Well, that same night I dropped off sleep as sound as a boy does, and all of a sudden the dog woke me up, coming to the bed, and thought I, now we're going to get it sharp, for he seemed more frightened than usual. After about 5 minutes, sure enough, came this cry. I can't give you no idea what it was like, and so near too, nearer than I'd heard it yet. And a funny thing, Mr. Lake, you know what a place this close is for an echo, and particular if you stand this side of it. Well, this cry never made no sign of an echo at all. But
As I said, it was dreadful near this night, and on top of the start I got with hearing it, I got another fright, for I heard something rustling outside in the passage. Now, to be sure, I thought I was done, but I noticed the dog seemed to perk up a bit, and next there was someone whisper outside the door, and I very near laughed out loud, for I knew it was my father and mother that had got out of bed with the noise. "Whatever is it?" says my mother. "Hush, I don't know," says my father, excited like. "Don't disturb the boy. I hope he didn't hear nothing." So, me knowing they were just outside, it made me bolder, and I slipped out of bed across to my little window, giving on the clothes, but the dog he bored right down to the bottom of the bed, and I looked out. First go off, I couldn't see anything. Then right down in the shadow, under a buttress, I made out what I shall always say was two spots of red. A dull red it was, nothing like a lamp or a fire, but just so as you could pick 'em out of the black shadow. I hadn't but just sighted 'em when it seemed we wasn't the only people that had been disturbed, because I see a window in the house on the left-hand side become lighted up, and the light moving. I just turned my head to make sure of it, and then looked back in the shadow for those two red things, and they were gone. And for all I peered about and started, there was not a sign more of 'em. Then come my last fright that night. Something come against my bare leg. But that was all right. That was my little dog had come out of bed, and prancing about making a great to-do, only holding his tongue, and me seeing it was crying in spirits again. I took him back to bed, and we slept the night out. Next morning I made out to tell my mother I'd had the dog in my room, and I was surprised, after all she'd said about it before, how quiet she took it. "Did you?" she says. "Well, by good rights you ought to go without your breakfast for doing such a thing behind my back, but I don't know as there any great harm done. Only another time you ask my permission, do you hear?" A bit after that I said something to my father about having heard the cats again. "Cats," he said, and he looked over at my poor mother, and she coughed, and he says, "Oh, yes, cats. I believe I heard them myself." Oh my goodness, so much accents. That was a funny morning altogether. Nothing seemed to go right. The organist he stopped in bed, and the minor canon he forgot it was the 19th day, and waited for the venite. And after a bit the deputy he set off playing the chant for Evanson, which was a minor, and then the Decani boys were laughing so much they couldn't sing. And when it came to the anthem, the solo boy he got took with the giggles, and made out his nose was bleeding, and shoved the book at me what hadn't practiced the verse, and wasn't much of a singer if I had known it. Well, things were rougher, you see, 50 years ago, and I got a nip from the countertenor behind me that I remembered. So we got through somehow, and neither the men nor the boys weren't by the way of waiting to see whether the canon in residence, Mr. Henslow it was, would come to the vestries and fine 'em. But I don't believe he did. For one thing, I'd fancied he'd read the wrong lesson for the first time in his life, and knew it. Anyhow, Evans and me didn't find no difficulty in slipping up the stairs, as I told you, and when we got up, we laid ourselves down flat on our stomachs, where we could just stretch out our heads out over the old tomb, and we hadn't but just done so when we heard the verger that was then, first shutting the iron porch gates, and locking the southwest door, and then the transept door, so we knew there was something up, and they meant to keep the public out for a bit. Next thing was the dean and the canon come in by their door on the north, and I see my father, and old Palmer and a couple of their best men. And Palmer stood a talking for a bit with the Dean in the middle of the choir. He had a coil of rope, and the men had crows. All of them looked a bit nervous. So there they stood talking, and at last I heard the Dean say, "Well, I've got no time to waste, Palmer. If you think this'll satisfy Southminster people, I'll permit it to be done. But I must say this, that never in the whole course of my life have I heard such arrant nonsense from a practical man as I have from you. Don't you agree with me, Henslow?" As far as I could hear, Mr. Henslow said something like, "Oh well, we've told, aren't we, Mr. Dean, not to judge others?" And the Dean he gave a kind of sniff, and walked straight up to the tomb, and took his stand behind it with his back to the screen. And the others they come edging up rather gingerly. Henslow he stopped on the south side, and scratched on his chin, he did. And then the Dean spoke up. "Palmer," he says, "which can you do easiest? Get the slab off the top, or shift one of the side slabs?" Old Palmer and his men they potted about a bit, looking round the edge of the top slab, and sounding the sides on the south and east and west and everywhere but the north. Henslow said something about it being better to have a try at the south side, because there were more light, and more rooms to move about in. Then my father, who'd been watching of them, went round to the north side, and knelt down, and felt to the slab by the chink. And he got up and dusted his knees, and says to the Dean, Pardon, Mr. Dean, but I think if Mr. Palmer try this here slab, he'll find it'll come out easy enough. Seems to me one of the men could prise it open out with his crow by means of this chink." Uh, thank you, Warby, says the Dean. "That's a good suggestion. Palmer, let one of your men do that, will you?" Whew! Excuse me. So the men come round and put his bar in. So the man come round and put his bar in and bore on it. And just that minute when they were all bending over, and we boys got our heads well over the edge of the triforum, there comes a most fearful crash down at the west end of the choir, as if a whole stack of big timber had fallen down a flight of stairs. Well, you can't expect me to tell you everything that happened all in a minute. Of course there was a terrible commotion. I heard the slab fall out, and the crowbar on the floor, and I heard the Dean say, "Good God!" When I looked down again, I saw the Dean tumbled over on the floor. The men was making off down the choir. Henslow was just going to help the Dean up. Palmer was going to stop the men, as he had said afterwards, and my father was sitting on the altar step with his face in his hands. The Dean he was very cross. "I wish to goodness you'd look where you're coming to, Henslow," he says. "Why you should all take to your heels when a stick of wood tumbles down, I cannot imagine." And all Henslow could do, explain he was right away on the other side of the tomb, would not satisfy him. Then Palmer came back, and reported there was nothing to account for this noise, and nothing seemingly fallen down. And when the Dean finished feeling of himself, they gathered round, except my father. He sat where he was, and someone lighted up a bit of candle, and they looked into the tomb. "Nothing there," says the Dean. "What did I tell you? Stay, here's something. What's this? Bit of music paper, and a piece of torn stuff. Part of a dress, it looks like. Both quite modern. No interest whatever. Another time perhaps you'll take the advice of an educated man, or something like that." And off he went, limping a bit, and out through the north door. Only as he went he called back angrily to Palmer for leaving the door standing open. Palmer called out, "Very sorry, sir," but he shrugged his shoulders, and Henslow says, "I fancy Mr. Dean's mistaken. I closed the door behind me." But he's a little upset. Then Palmer says, "Why, where's Warby?" They saw him sitting on the step, and went up to him. He was recovering himself, it seems. and wiping his forehead, and Palmer helped him up onto his legs, as I was glad to see. They were too far off for me to hear what they said. My father pointed to the north door in the aisle, and Palmer and Henslow, both of them, looked very surprised and scared. After a bit my father and Henslow went out to the church, and the others made what haste they could to put the slab back and plaster it in. And about as the clock struck 12, the cathedral was open again, and us boys made the best of our way home. I was in a great talking to know what it was had given my poor father such a turn, and when I got in and found him sitting in his chair taking a glass of spirits, and my mother standing looking anxious at him, I couldn't keep from bursting out and making confession where I'd been. But he didn't seem to take on, not in the way of losing his temper. "You were there, was you? Well, did you see it?" "I see everything, father," I said, "except when the noise came." "Did you see what it was knocked the Dean over?" he says. "That what come out of the monument?" "You didn't? Well, that's a mercy." "Why, what was it, father?" I said. "Come, you must have seen it," he says. "Didn't you see it?" "A thing like a man, all over hair, and two great eyes to it." Well, that was all I could get out of him that time, and later on he seemed as if he was ashamed of being so frightened, and he used to put me off when I asked him about it. But years after, when I got to be a grown man, we had more talk now and again on the matter, and he always said the same thing. "Black it was," he says, "and a mass of hair, and two legs, and the light caught on its eyes." Well, that's the tale of that tomb, Mr. Lake. It's one we don't tell to our visitors, and I shall be obliged to you not to make any use of it till I'm out of the way. I doubt Mr. Evans feels the same as I do, if you ask him. This proved to be the case, but over 20 years have passed by, and the grass is growing over both Warby and Evans, so Mr. Lake felt no difficulty about communicating his notes, taken in 1890, to me. He accompanied them with a sketch of the tomb, and a copy of the short inscription on the metal cross, which was affixed at the expense of Dr. Lyell to the center of the northern side. It was from the Vulgate of Isaiah XXX 1V, and consisted merely of three words: Ibi Kubavit Lamia. Here lies a vampire. Well, that was a long one, and a very difficult one. Oh, my poor throat. Oh, my poor throat. It was long, but I think it's worth it. It's honestly, I think, one of his more atmospheric stories. Dr. Zadie, your voice's sacrifice is appreciated. Oh, I should have left. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yes. Oh, well, let's move on to the chat. Let me close the curtains first. Always best to close curtains.
let me move on to our little chat room and we'll close out the evening. Here we are. Oh, yes, that was quite a long story. But again, I think it's worth it. Once in a while, it's good to read some of these longer short stories. Julian20, great stories. Saying, oh, you're very welcome. I know M.R. James's stories tend to be a little bit on the drier side. I know when it comes to some of the telling, but it really is, as you can tell, when it comes to the way it's told, it's meant to be told to an audience. It builds. It's not a written story. It's a told story, as if that makes sense to all of you. Um, so yes, whew, I am quite worn out. So next week we will be continuing, much to my detriment, with more of Alone in the Dark, and then on Thursday we will be doing more scary stories. I haven't yet picked which author we will be reading from. I've got a couple choices, but nonetheless, we will be having some fun there. For the night, let's see who we should raid for tonight. Oh, looks like DadTuber is here. As raiding. Looks like DadTuber is streaming. Haven't been actually to one of his streams in a while. Might be a good idea to raid him. He is doing games plus demos. So yes, I think we'll raid him tonight. But for now, my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Till we meet again, my dear scholars. Farewell, take care, and I shall see you next time at the study.